After my wife passed away, we had the inheritance meeting. My daughter-in-law smiled coldly. Now that the old woman is gone, you'll put the company in my son's name and fend for yourself. I smiled, but when my lawyer walked into the room, he read the DNA test out loud. I'm glad to have you here. Follow my story until the end and comment the city you're watching from so I can see how far my story has reached. I'm Stephen, and I'm 61 years old. 7 days ago, I buried my wife Margaret after 35 years of marriage. 7 days, and already my family was circling like vultures around what they thought was theirs. The funeral had been a blur of condolences and hollow words. People who barely knew Margaret suddenly appeared with stories about her kindness, her generosity. But the most painful part wasn't the grief. It was watching my son Norman and his wife Olivia barely contain their impatience during the service. While I was saying goodbye to the woman I'd loved since I was 26, they were already calculating their inheritance. Today was the day we'd discuss Margaret's will, and I'd asked everyone to gather in my study at 3 o'clock sharp. The same study where I'd built Crawford Industries from nothing, working 18-hour days while Margaret raised Norman. The same room where I'd made the decisions that turned a small construction company into a multi-million-dollar empire worth approximately $12 million. I sat behind my mahogany desk, the one Margaret had given me for our 10th anniversary, running my fingers over its polished surface. Everything in this room held memories of her. The crystal paperweight she'd brought back from our trip to Ireland. The family photo from Norman's high school graduation where we all looked genuinely happy. That felt like a lifetime ago. Norman arrived first, as he always did when money was involved. At 33, he'd inherited Margaret's tall frame, but none of her warmth. His expensive suit, the kind I'd been buying him since he graduated college without ever working a real job, was perfectly pressed. Behind him walked Olivia, his wife of 8 years, her blonde hair styled in that artificial way that probably cost more than most people's weekly salary. "Dad," Norman said, settling into the leather chair across from my desk. His voice carried that tone I'd grown to hate, the one that said he was humoring an old man. "I know this is difficult, but we need to discuss the practical matters." Olivia didn't even pretend to offer sympathy. She perched on the edge of the other chair, her manicured nails drumming against her designer purse. "Stephen, we appreciate you calling this meeting. Norman and I have been talking, and we think it's time to make some important decisions about the company." I studied her face, noting the barely contained excitement in her green eyes. Olivia had never worked a day in her life, had married Norman straight out of college when she realized he was set to inherit everything. She'd spent 8 years playing the perfect daughter-in-law while calculating every asset we owned. "The company?" I asked, keeping my voice neutral. "What about it?" Norman shifted forward, his expression earnest in that practiced way he'd perfected over the years. "Well, with Mom gone, it makes sense to transfer everything to my name. You're 61, Dad. You should be thinking about retirement, enjoying your golden years." I almost laughed at that. Golden years. As if I hadn't earned every gray hair on my head building something from nothing while my son learned to expect everything handed to him. "Besides," Olivia added, her voice sickeningly sweet, "now that the old lady is gone, we can finally modernize things, bring the company into the 21st century. The old lady." She called Margaret the old lady. Something cold settled in my chest, but I kept my expression calm. Margaret had always defended Olivia, insisting she just needed time to adjust to our family. Even after Olivia had made snide comments about our outdated traditions, even after she'd rolled her eyes during Margaret's stories about the early days of the company, Margaret had continued to include her, to love her like the daughter she'd never had. "Modernize how?" I asked, genuinely curious about what Olivia thought she knew about running a business. "Well, for starters, we could sell off some of the smaller properties. That old warehouse district you're so attached to? It's prime real estate now. We could make millions flipping it to developers." Olivia's eyes gleamed as she spoke. "And that construction crew you've kept on payroll for 20 years? Half of them are ready for retirement anyway. Those men had helped me build everything. Tony Fernandez had been with me since the beginning, had worked overtime without complaint when we landed our first big contract. Jim Sullivan had a son in college and another getting married next year. But to Olivia, they were just numbers on a spreadsheet. Mom always said you were too sentimental about business, Norman added, his tone gentle but patronizing. "It's time to think with your head, not your heart." Margaret had never said that. If anything, she'd always supported my decision to treat our employees like family. She'd hosted Christmas parties for them, remembered their children's names, sent flowers when they lost loved ones. But Norman and Olivia had rewritten history to suit their narrative. I looked at my son, this man I'd raised, educated, supported for 33 years, and tried to find something familiar in his face. When had he become so calculating? When had the boy who used to help me in the workshop on weekends turned into someone who spoke about his mother's death as an opportunity? "You seem to have this all figured out," I said finally. Olivia smiled, mistaking my calm for agreement. "We've put a lot of thought into it. Norman has some excellent ideas about expanding into commercial development. With the right investments, we could double the company's value in 5 years. Double it by destroying everything Margaret and I had built together, by firing people who'd been loyal for decades, by turning our family business into another soulless corporation focused only on profit margins. There's just one thing," I said, opening the top drawer of my desk. Inside was a manila envelope I'd been carrying for the past week, sealed and waiting for this moment. "We need to wait for my attorney." Norman frowned. "Attorney? Dad, this is just family. We don't need lawyers for a simple transfer." "Oh, but we do," I said, feeling something I hadn't felt in days, a small spark of satisfaction. "Because there are some things about this inheritance that you don't know." Olivia's smile faltered slightly. "What kind of things?" "The kind that require legal documentation." I checked my watch. 3:15. "David should be here any minute." The room fell silent except for the ticking of the grandfather clock Margaret had insisted we buy for our 25th anniversary. Norman and Olivia exchanged glances, and I could see the first hint of uncertainty creeping into their expressions. "Dad, you're being dramatic," Norman said, but his voice had lost some of its confidence. "What could possibly require an attorney that we can't discuss as a family?" I met his eyes directly for the first time since he'd arrived. "Son, there are things about this family that you've never known. Things your mother and I decided to keep private to protect you." Olivia leaned forward, her composure slipping. "What things?" The doorbell rang before I could answer, echoing through the house like a bell tolling the end of their assumptions. I stood slowly, feeling every one of my 61 years in my bones, but also feeling lighter than I had in decades. "That would be David," I said, walking toward the door. "And after today, you'll understand why your mother's death changes nothing about this company's ownership." As I left them sitting in stunned silence, I heard Olivia whisper urgently to Norman, "What is he talking about?" But Norman had no answer. How could he? He'd never bothered to learn the real story of his birth, the real story of our family. He'd been content to live in the comfortable lie we'd built around him. Today, that lie was about to crumble, and with it, every assumption they'd made about their future. David Hendricks had been my attorney for 15 years, ever since the old family lawyer retired. He was a sharp man in his 50s, the kind who never said more than necessary, but always came prepared. Today he carried a leather briefcase that seemed heavier than usual, and his expression was more serious than I'd ever seen it. "Stephen," he said, shaking my hand firmly, "I'm sorry for your loss. Margaret was a remarkable woman." "Thank you, David." They're waiting in the study. As we walked down the hallway, past the family photos that chronicled 33 years of carefully constructed happiness, I felt the weight of what was about to happen. Margaret had begged me to take this secret to our graves. "He's your son in every way that matters," she'd said during our last conversation in the hospital. "Don't destroy that." But sitting in that room today, watching Olivia disrespect Margaret's memory and listening to Norman speak about her death as a business opportunity, I knew Margaret had been wrong. Some truths needed to see daylight, especially when people tried to profit from lies. Norman and Olivia stood when we entered. David nodded politely to them, but I could see his professional mask was firmly in place. He knew what was coming. "David, you remember my son Norman and his wife Olivia?" I said, settling back into my chair. "Of course. Again, my condolences on your mother's passing," David said to Norman, who nodded stiffly. Olivia had regained some of her composure, but I noticed her hands were clenched in her lap. "Mr. Hendricks, we appreciate you coming. But this really is just a family matter." Stephen was about to transfer the company assets to Norman. David's eyebrows rose slightly as he looked at me. "Is that so?" "Actually," I said, enjoying the moment more than I probably should have, "that's not quite accurate. I asked you here because there are some documents Norman and Olivia need to see before any transfers can be discussed." David opened his briefcase and pulled out a thick folder. "Stephen, are you certain you want to proceed with this? Once this information is shared, there's no going back." Norman's face had gone pale. "What information? Dad, what is this about?" I looked at my son, the boy I'd raised, the man I'd supported, the person who'd just spent the last hour planning to dismantle everything his mother and I had built. Norman, do you remember when you were 7 and you asked me why you didn't look like me? A flicker of confusion crossed his face. You said I looked like Mom's side of the family. I lied. The words hung in the air like smoke. Olivia's mouth opened slightly, and Norman actually took a step backward. David, I said quietly, please show them the DNA test results. David removed a laboratory report from the folder, the kind with official letterhead and scientific terminology that left no room for interpretation. He placed it on the desk where all three of us could see it. This test was conducted 3 weeks ago, David said in his professional voice. It compares DNA samples from Stephen Crawford and Norman Crawford. Norman's hands shook as he reached for the paper. I watched his eyes scan the technical jargon until they reached the conclusion in bold letters. Probability of paternity, 0%. This is impossible, Olivia whispered, but her voice lacked conviction. I'm afraid it's quite conclusive, David said. Norman is not Stephen's biological son. The silence that followed was deafening. Norman sank into his chair, the paper still clutched in his hands. Olivia stared at me as if I'd physically struck her. But how? Norman's voice was barely audible. When did you know? I leaned back, feeling a strange mixture of relief and sadness. The secret I'd carried for 26 years was finally free. I suspected when you were 7. You were curious about genetics in school, asking questions about eye color and blood types. So I had a test done privately. 26 years? Olivia's voice was shrill now. You've known for 26 years? 26 years, I confirmed, and in all that time, I never said a word. I raised you, Norman. I paid for your education, your wedding, your house. I treated you exactly like my son because that's what I chose to do. Norman looked up from the paper, his eyes filled with tears. Why? Why would you do that? The question I'd been dreading. Because the answer revealed just how broken our family had been long before Margaret's death. Because your mother begged me to, I said simply. She made a mistake, Norman. A terrible mistake that lasted one weekend when we were going through a rough patch in our marriage. She regretted it immediately, but by the time she realized she was pregnant, it was too late to undo what had happened. I could see Norman trying to process this, trying to reconcile the mother he'd known with the woman I was describing. Who? He asked. Who was he? A client, someone who was working with us on a project in Chicago. Margaret had gone there for a conference. I was stuck here dealing with a construction crisis. We'd been fighting about money, about the future of the company. She was lonely, he was charming, and she made a choice she spent the rest of her life regretting. Olivia had gone very quiet, but I could see her mind racing, calculating what this meant for their plans. The man's name was Robert Hayes, I continued. He died in a car accident when you were 12. Margaret never told him about you. As far as I know, you're his only child. Norman set the paper down with trembling hands. So everything I thought I knew about my life is a lie. No, I said firmly. The love your mother and I had for you was real. The life we built together was real. The only lie was the biology. But the company, Olivia said suddenly, her voice sharp with panic. If Norman isn't your son, then what happens to the inheritance? And there it was. Even faced with the complete upheaval of her husband's identity, her first concern was money. David cleared his throat. That's actually why Stephen asked me here today. The inheritance situation is more complicated than you might think. He pulled out another document, this one thick with legal language and official seals. You see, Crawford Industries was never part of any joint estate planning with Margaret. Stephen has maintained sole ownership of the company throughout their marriage. Margaret's will, which was read last week, pertains only to personal assets, the house, her jewelry, her personal accounts. Olivia's face went white. What are you saying? I'm saying, David continued, that the company was never going to be inherited by Norman, biological son or not. It has always been Stephen's to dispose of as he sees fit. Norman looked at me with an expression I couldn't quite read. You mean all this time while we were planning for me to take over the company? You were planning, I corrected. I never made any such promises. The truth was settling over them like a heavy blanket. Norman wasn't my biological son, which meant he had no blood claim to anything. But more importantly, he'd never had a legal claim either. The company I'd built from nothing remained mine to control. "This is insane," Olivia said, standing up abruptly. "You can't just destroy a family like this. Norman has been your son for 33 years. You can't take that away now." "I'm not taking anything away," I said calmly. "I'm simply revealing what has always been true. The question now is what Norman chooses to do with this information." Norman was staring at the DNA test results again, his whole world reorganizing itself around this new reality. "Did Mom suffer?" he asked suddenly, knowing this secret. "Every day," I admitted. "She wanted to tell you so many times, especially when you started working at the company. But she was terrified you'd hate her for the lie." "And you? Did you hate her?" I considered the question, thinking about 35 years of marriage, the good times and the difficult ones. For about 6 months, yes. I was furious, hurt, betrayed. But then I realized that hating her wouldn't change anything. You were here, you were innocent, and she was genuinely sorry. So I made a choice to forgive and move forward. "How noble," Olivia said sarcastically. "And now you're using this information to what, punish us?" I looked at her with the calm I'd been cultivating for years. "I'm not punishing anyone, Olivia. I'm simply making sure everyone understands the reality of the situation before any decisions are made about the future." David gathered his papers back into the folder. "Stephen, do you want me to explain the legal implications?" "Please." "Norman, as you're not Stephen's biological son, you have no automatic inheritance rights to Crawford Industries. However, Stephen could still choose to leave you the company in his will if he desired. That remains entirely his decision." The word "could" hung in the air like a challenge. Norman looked at me with something between hope and fear. "What do you want from me?" he asked. It was the first time in years that Norman had asked what I wanted instead of demanding what he thought he deserved. But before I could answer, Olivia's phone rang. She glanced at it, and her face went even paler. "I have to take this," she said, stepping toward the window. As she whispered urgently into the phone, I wondered what new crisis was developing. But honestly, at this point, I was beyond caring about Olivia's problems. The real question was whether Norman could handle the truth about his life, and more importantly, whether he could become the man his mother and I had always hoped he would be. But judging by the way he was looking at that DNA test, I suspected we were about to find out just how deep his character really went. Olivia's phone call lasted exactly 4 minutes and 37 seconds. I know because I watched the clock on my desk, noting how her voice grew more agitated with each passing moment. When she finally hung up, her face had taken on a grayish pallor that made her expensive makeup look garish. "Everything all right?" I asked. Though her distress was obvious, she forced a smile that didn't reach her eyes. "Just a friend calling about Margaret's funeral arrangements. Nothing important." It was a lie. I'd been watching people lie to me for 40 years in business, and Olivia had never been particularly skilled at deception. But I let it slide for now. There were more pressing matters to address. Norman was still holding the DNA test results, turning the pages as if somehow the words would change if he stared at them long enough. The boy I'd raised had always been this way, unable to accept unpleasant realities until they absolutely forced themselves upon him. "Norman," I said gently, "I know this is a shock, but we need to discuss what this means for the future." He looked up, his eyes red-rimmed but dry. "What future? Everything I thought I knew about myself is a lie." "Not everything," I insisted. "The man you've become, the education you received, the opportunities you've had, those were all real. The love your mother and I had for you was real. But the inheritance," Olivia interjected, her voice sharp with barely controlled panic. "If Norman isn't your biological son, then legally." "Legally," David said, consulting his notes, "Norman has no automatic claim to anything. However, that doesn't mean Stephen couldn't choose to provide for him." I stood up slowly, my back aching from the tension of the afternoon. Walking to the window, I looked out at the grounds Margaret had lovingly maintained for 3 decades. The rose garden where she'd spent countless hours, the oak tree we'd planted when Norman graduated high school, the gazebo where we'd hosted family barbecues every summer. "There's something else you both need to understand," I said without turning around. "The company has never been in any danger of being inherited by anyone." I heard Olivia's sharp intake of breath behind me. "What do you mean?" Norman asked. I turned to face them, my hands clasped behind my back. "Crawford Industries has been structured as a trust for the past 15 years. Margaret and I established it when the company's value reached $5 million. The trust ensures that the business continues to operate according to specific guidelines, regardless of who controls it." David nodded, pulling out another document. The Crawford Family Trust has very specific provisions about succession. Stephen serves as the primary trustee, but the ultimate beneficiaries and the conditions of inheritance are clearly outlined. Olivia leaned forward, her knuckles white as she gripped the arms of her chair. What conditions? The trust requires that any successor demonstrate a genuine commitment to the company's values and employees, I explained. They must work in the business for a minimum of 5 years in a meaningful capacity, not just as a figurehead. They must show financial responsibility and ethical behavior, and they must understand that the company exists to serve the community, not just to generate profit. Norman's face went pale. 5 years of actual work? The question revealed everything I needed to know about his character. In 8 years of marriage to Olivia, Norman had worked sporadically at the company, usually in comfortable positions that required little real effort. He'd shown up when it suited him, delegated actual work to others, and spent most of his time planning how to spend the money he expected to inherit. 5 years of real contribution, I confirmed. Learning the business from the ground up, understanding how we operate, why we make the decisions we do, what our responsibilities are to our employees and their families. That's ridiculous, Olivia said, her composure finally cracking. Norman has an MBA from Northwestern. He doesn't need to learn construction from the bottom up. His MBA taught him theory, I said calmly. It didn't teach him what it means to be responsible for 63 families who depend on Crawford Industries for their livelihoods. I walked back to my desk and opened the bottom drawer, pulling out a thick folder I'd been preparing for months. This contains financial records for every employee we have, I said, setting it on the desk. Their salaries, their family's medical needs, their children's college plans. Every decision we make affects real people with real problems. Norman reached for the folder with trembling hands. As he opened it, I watched his expression change from confusion to something approaching understanding. Tony Fernandez has been with us for 22 years, I continued. His daughter just started at the University of Illinois. His wife is undergoing cancer treatment. The insurance we provide is the only thing standing between their family and bankruptcy. I flipped to another page. Jim Sullivan has twin boys who will be college-aged in 3 years. His wife teaches elementary school. They've been saving for 15 years to give those boys opportunities they never had. Dad, I know these people, Norman said quietly. You know their names, I corrected. You don't know their stories. You don't understand what it would mean to their lives if someone decided to modernize the company by cutting staff or selling assets. Olivia stood up abruptly, her face flushed with anger. This is emotional manipulation. You're trying to guilt Norman into accepting whatever scraps you decide to throw him. I'm trying to help him understand what real responsibility looks like, I said, meeting her glare steadily. Something neither of you has ever demonstrated. How dare you, she snapped. Norman has worked hard his entire life. I almost laughed at that. Norman has never worked hard a day in his life. He's coasted on expectations and entitlement, just like you have. The words hung in the air like a slap. Norman flinched, but he didn't deny it. Deep down, he knew I was right. But here's what I'm prepared to offer, I continued, looking directly at my son. If Norman wants to prove he's worthy of inheriting this company, he can start tomorrow. Entry-level position, normal salary, no special treatment. He works his way up like everyone else, learns every aspect of the business, and demonstrates that he understands what it means to be a leader. And if he does that, Olivia asked, her voice tight, if he does that successfully for 5 years, shows genuine growth and commitment, then yes, the trust provisions allow for him to inherit controlling interest in Crawford Industries. Norman looked up from the employee files, his expression more serious than I'd seen it in years. And if I don't? Then the trust dissolves the company and distributes the assets according to other provisions I've established. The employees receive generous severance packages, and the remaining value goes to charitable organizations that Margaret and I supported. You destroy the company rather than let Norman inherit it. Olivia's voice was shrill with disbelief. I'd prevent the company from being destroyed by someone who doesn't understand its true value, I corrected. Crawford Industries isn't just a source of profit. It's a legacy, a responsibility, a commitment to the people who've helped build it. David cleared his throat. Stephen, should I explain the timeline? I nodded. Norman has 30 days to decide whether he wants to accept these terms. If he chooses not to, or if he starts and then quits before completing the 5-year commitment, the dissolution process begins immediately. The room fell silent except for the ticking of the grandfather clock. Norman was staring at the employee files, his face cycling through emotions I couldn't quite read. Olivia was breathing rapidly, clearly calculating the implications of what I'd just revealed. "There's one more thing," I said, pulling out the final document from my desk. "Olivia, this concerns you directly." Her head snapped up, eyes wide with alarm. "The trust includes provisions about family stability and influence. If Norman chooses to accept this challenge, he'll need to demonstrate that his personal life supports his professional growth." "What does that mean?" she asked, though I could see she already suspected. "It means that anyone who actively undermines the company's values or tries to manipulate Norman's decisions will be considered a disqualifying influence." I handed her the document. "These are the specific behavioral requirements outlined in the trust. I suggest you read them carefully." As Olivia scanned the pages, her face went through a series of expressions: confusion, anger, then pure terror, as she realized what she was reading. "This is a prenuptial agreement," she whispered. "Modified and updated as of last month," David confirmed. "If Norman accepts the challenge and Olivia's behavior is deemed detrimental to his success, the marriage becomes grounds for disqualification from the inheritance." Norman looked up sharply. "You're asking me to choose between my wife and the company?" "I'm asking you to choose between enabling destructive behavior and taking responsibility for your future," I said. "The choice is entirely yours." But as I watched Olivia's face crumple with the realization that her 8-year investment in this marriage might be worthless, I knew that the real test was just beginning. The question wasn't whether Norman would choose the company over his wife. The question was whether he had the strength to choose the man he could become over the boy he'd always been. And judging by the way he was looking at those employee files, studying the faces of people whose livelihoods depended on his decisions, I thought there might be hope for him yet. But Olivia's next words shattered that fragile optimism. "Norman," she said, her voice deadly quiet, "we need to talk, privately." And I realized that the real battle for my son's soul was about to begin. "Absolutely not," Olivia said, her voice sharp enough to cut glass. "Norman, we are not discussing private family matters in front of him." The way she said him, referring to me as if I were a stranger rather than the man who'd raised Norman for 33 years, told me everything I needed to know about where this conversation was heading. "Olivia," Norman said quietly, still holding the employee files, "maybe we should hear Dad out completely before we make any decisions." "Your father," she laughed, but there was no humor in it. "Norman, he just told you that you're not his biological son. He's been lying to you your entire life, and now he wants to hold that over your head to control you." I watched my son's face carefully, looking for signs of how her words were affecting him. Norman had always been susceptible to Olivia's manipulation, but something in his expression suggested the DNA revelation had shaken him more deeply than she realized. "The lying was to protect him," I said calmly, "just like every other sacrifice Margaret and I made over the years." "Sacrifice?" Olivia's voice rose an octave. "You mean like the sacrifice of paying for his education at the best schools? Or the sacrifice of giving him a job at your company without him having to earn it? Those kinds of sacrifices?" David shifted uncomfortably in his chair. "Perhaps I should give you some privacy to discuss this." "No," I said firmly. "Stay. I want a witness to whatever threats are about to be made." Olivia's eyes flashed dangerously. "Threats? Who's making threats? You're the one trying to blackmail your own son into 5 years of manual labor." "I'm offering him the opportunity to earn something meaningful," I corrected, "something no one can take away from him." "What he should have inherited automatically," she shot back, "if you hadn't decided to play God with DNA tests and legal technicalities." Norman set the files down and looked at his wife with an expression I'd never seen before, disappointment mixed with something that might have been recognition. "Olivia, stop," he said quietly. "Stop." She whirled on him. "Norman, he's manipulating you. Can't you see that? He drops this bombshell about your paternity, then immediately offers you a way to earn what should have been yours anyway. It's psychological warfare." I had to admit, she wasn't entirely wrong about the manipulation aspect. I had deliberately chosen this moment to reveal both the DNA results and the trust provisions. But her interpretation of my motives was completely backwards. "You think this is about control?" I said to Olivia. "But it's actually about freedom. I'm giving Norman the chance to prove to himself that he's capable of more than either of you believe." "Freedom?" She laughed harshly. 5 years of grunt work under your thumb is freedom. 5 years of learning to stand on his own, without handouts or expectations, is freedom," I said, "something he's never experienced." Norman was quiet through this exchange, his gaze moving between his wife and me like he was watching a tennis match. But I could see something shifting in his expression, a growing awareness that this conversation was about more than inheritance. "Norman," Olivia said, her voice suddenly softer, more calculating. "Think about what he's really asking. He wants you to abandon everything we've planned, everything we've worked toward, to prove yourself to a man who's admitted he's not even your real father." That hit Norman like a physical blow. I saw him flinch, saw the pain cross his features. "He raised me," Norman said quietly. "Biology doesn't change that, doesn't it?" Olivia pressed. "Norman, your real father might have been a successful businessman too. You might have inherited traits, abilities, connections that could serve you better than crawling around construction sites for 5 years. I felt a cold fury building in my chest. She was trying to poison Norman against not just me, but against the very foundation of who he was. Robert Hayes was a mid-level marketing executive who died drunk behind the wheel of his car, I said, my voice cutting through her fantasy. He had no business, no inheritance, no legacy, except the son he never knew existed. Olivia's face went white, but she recovered quickly. "Then Norman's better off without both of you controlling his life." "What exactly are you suggesting?" Norman asked. She turned to face him fully, taking his hands in hers. "We leave, tonight. We take what money we have, move somewhere else, start fresh. You don't need to prove anything to anyone." "With what money?" Norman asked. "Everything we have comes from Dad. The house, the car, even our bank accounts are tied to Crawford Industries. We'll figure it out," she said, but I could hear the desperation creeping into her voice. "You're smart, educated. You can get a job anywhere." Norman stared at her for a long moment, and I could see him really looking at his wife perhaps for the first time in years. Seeing not the supportive partner she pretended to be, but the woman who would rather have him fail independently than succeed under my guidance. "What job, Olivia?" he asked quietly. "Doing what?" "I have an MBA and 8 years of showing up to an office where I never learned anything meaningful. Who's going to hire me for anything that pays enough to maintain the lifestyle you're accustomed to?" She dropped his hands as if they'd burned her. "So you're just going to let him control you forever?" "I'm going to consider an opportunity to actually earn something for the first time in my life," Norman said, his voice growing stronger. "Maybe find out who I really am when I'm not just living off someone else's work." I felt a spark of pride at those words, the first real hope I'd had in years that my son might have inherited something valuable from me after all. Not genes, but character. "Norman," Olivia said, her voice taking on a desperate edge, "think about what you're saying. 5 years of construction work, manual labor, that's not who you are." "How do you know who I am?" Norman asked. "How do I know who I am? I've never actually tested myself." Olivia's phone rang again, the same urgent tone as before. This time she declined the call, but not before I saw her face go pale again. "Who keeps calling you?" Norman asked, noticing her reaction. "It's nothing," she said quickly. "Just my sister being dramatic about wedding planning." Another lie. Olivia's sister had been married for 3 years. "David," I said, "could you excuse us for a moment? I think the family needs to have a private conversation." David nodded, gathering his papers. "I'll be in the kitchen if you need me. Take your time." After he left, I turned to face Norman and Olivia directly. "There's something else you both need to know. The reason I decided to reveal everything today wasn't just about the inheritance." Norman looked up sharply. "What do you mean?" I walked to my desk and pulled out a folder I'd been hoping not to use. "Olivia, that phone call wasn't from your sister, was it?" Her face went ashen. "I don't know what you're talking about." "It was from Marcus Reeves at First National Bank," I continued. "About the personal loan you took out 3 months ago using this house as collateral." Norman's head snapped toward his wife. "What loan?" Olivia's mouth opened and closed like a fish gasping for air. "Norman, I can explain. The loan for $250,000, I continued relentlessly, that you've already defaulted on. The loan you took out without Norman's knowledge, forging his signature on the application." The silence that followed was deafening. Norman stared at his wife as if he'd never seen her before. "You mortgaged our house?" he whispered. "It's not our house," she said desperately. "It's his house. He owns everything, Norman. I was trying to get us some independence. By committing fraud?" Norman's voice was rising now. "Olivia, what did you do with the money?" She looked around the room like a trapped animal. "I invested it in a business opportunity. It was supposed to be a sure thing. What business opportunity? I asked, though I already knew the answer from the private investigator's report sitting in my safe. A spa franchise, she said weakly, in Phoenix. My friend Kelly said we could triple our investment in 6 months. Norman put his head in his hands. Olivia, tell me you didn't lose $250,000 to some pyramid scheme. Her silence was answer enough. The bank wants their money, I said quietly. They called me this morning because they can't reach you. They're starting foreclosure proceedings on Monday. Norman looked up at me with pure desperation. Dad, I didn't know. I swear I didn't know anything about this. I know, I said. That's why I'm prepared to make you an offer. Both of them stared at me. I'll pay off the loan, I said, all of it, but only if Norman accepts the 5-year challenge, and only if Olivia agrees to certain conditions. What conditions? She asked, though her voice suggested she already dreaded the answer. You return to school and get a job. A real job, not some fantasy business venture. You attend financial counseling to learn how to manage money responsibly. And you never, ever use any asset connected to this family as collateral for anything without written permission. Olivia's face cycled through rage, humiliation, and finally something resembling fear as she realized her options had just evaporated. And if we refuse? Norman asked. Then you declare bankruptcy, lose the house, and start over with nothing but the clothes on your backs, I said simply. Your choice. Norman looked at his wife, then at me, then at the employee files still scattered across my desk. I could see him weighing his options, perhaps for the first time in his adult life, forced to make a decision based on reality rather than expectations. I need time to think, he said finally. You have until tomorrow morning, I said. The bank wants an answer by close of business Monday. As they left, Norman walking like a man in a daze and Olivia practically vibrating with fury, I wondered if I'd just saved my son or destroyed him. But watching him pause in the doorway to look back at those employee files one more time, I thought maybe, just maybe, I'd given him the push he needed to finally grow up. Time would tell if it was enough. Norman didn't call that evening, or the next morning. By 10 o'clock Sunday, I was starting to wonder if he'd taken Olivia's advice and simply disappeared. It wouldn't have been the first time he'd run from a difficult decision, though it would certainly be the most expensive. I was having my second cup of coffee when I heard a car in the driveway. Through the kitchen window, I watched Norman get out of his BMW alone. No Olivia. That was either a very good sign or a very bad one. He knocked on the front door, which struck me as odd, since he'd always just walked in before. I opened it to find my son looking like he'd aged 5 years overnight. His clothes were wrinkled, his hair disheveled, and there were dark circles under his eyes that suggested he'd spent the night wrestling with demons I knew all too well. Dad, he said quietly, can we talk? I stepped aside to let him in. Coffee, please. We sat at the kitchen table where Margaret had served thousands of meals over the years, where she'd helped Norman with homework, where we'd discussed everything from his first girlfriend to his career plans. The same table where she'd cried when I confronted her about the affair 34 years ago. Where's Olivia? I asked, pouring him a cup. Norman stared into the coffee like it might contain answers. At her mother's. We had a long conversation last night. A very long conversation. I imagine you did. He looked up at me with eyes that reminded me painfully of Margaret. She knew about my real father. I felt my stomach drop. What? She's known for 2 years. She hired a private investigator after we started having financial problems. She thought if she could prove I wasn't your biological son, she could contest your will directly, cut you out of the picture entirely. I set my coffee cup down harder than necessary. She what? The investigator found Robert Hayes' death certificate, tracked down people who knew him and Mom. Olivia's been planning this for 2 years, Dad. She married me thinking I'd inherit everything, and when that looked uncertain, she decided to take matters into her own hands. The betrayal I felt wasn't for myself. It was for Norman, who just discovered that his wife had married him for money and stayed married to him for the same reason. The loan, I said, understanding flooding through me. She took it out because she thought she could force a settlement before you inherited anything legitimately. Norman nodded miserably. She was going to use the money to hire lawyers to challenge the trust. She figured if she could prove you weren't my father and that you'd been defrauding the inheritance laws somehow, she could get a court to force an immediate transfer of assets. Except she lost the money to a scam instead. Kelly Morrison isn't her friend, Norman said bitterly. She's a con artist who runs fake investment schemes targeting desperate housewives. Olivia found her online and thought she was smarter than everyone else who'd been suckered. I studied my son's face, looking for signs of how he was processing this cascade of revelations. How are you handling all this? Norman laughed, but there was no humor in it. My wife married me for money I was never going to inherit, based on a father I never actually had, using information she kept secret while planning to destroy the only real father I've ever known. How do you think I'm handling it? I think you're stronger than you realize, I said carefully. The fact that you're here, asking questions instead of running away, tells me something important about your character. Does it? Norman's voice was raw, because I feel like I don't know anything about myself anymore. I don't know who my real father was. I don't know if anything I believed about my life was true, and I apparently can't even pick a trustworthy wife. I leaned forward, choosing my words carefully. Norman, the man who raised you was real. The love your mother had for you was real. The opportunities you've had were real. The only thing that wasn't real was Olivia's motives. He was quiet for a long time, staring out the window at Margaret's rose garden. She wants me to fight you. She says if I take your challenge, I'm letting you control me for another 5 years. What do you think? I think. He paused, struggling with the words. I think I've been controlled my whole life. First by expectations, then by comfort, then by Olivia's ambitions. Maybe it's time I found out what I'm actually capable of when I'm working for something that matters. I felt something I hadn't experienced in years, genuine pride in my son. The challenge isn't just about proving yourself to me, I said. It's about proving something to yourself. Norman nodded slowly. I know. That's why I'm going to accept it. Relief flooded through me, but I kept my voice steady. And Olivia? His face hardened in a way I'd never seen before. Olivia has a choice to make. She can support this decision and work on becoming a better person, or she can leave. I'm not going to let her sabotage this opportunity. That's not going to be easy, I warned him. She's invested 8 years in a particular vision of your future, a vision based on lies and theft, Norman said. Dad, she forged my signature. She committed fraud using our home as collateral. Even if I wanted to trust her again, how could I? It was a fair question, and one that told me Norman was finally thinking clearly about his marriage. There's something else, he continued. Something I need to tell you before I start this challenge. I waited. I've been scared of you my entire life, he said quietly. Scared of disappointing you, scared of not measuring up, scared that you'd figure out I wasn't good enough to be your son. The words hit me like a physical blow. Norman, let me finish, he said. I realize now that fear kept me from ever really trying. It was easier to coast, to take the easy positions at the company, to let you handle the real decisions. Because if I never really tried, I could always tell myself that I would have succeeded if I'd wanted to. I saw so much of myself in that confession. The young man who'd been terrified of failing, who'd almost let that fear keep him from starting Crawford Industries at all. But yesterday, reading those employee files, seeing what the company really means to people like Tony and Jim, I realized something. Norman continued. I don't want to be the kind of person who's afraid of trying. I don't want to be the kind of man who lets other people carry his responsibilities. That takes courage, I said. Yeah, well, maybe I inherited some of that from you after all, Norman said with a small smile, even if it's not genetic. We sat in comfortable silence for a few minutes, both of us processing the weight of what had just shifted between us. When do I start? Norman asked finally. Tomorrow morning, 6 a.m. We'll start with the Riverside project. New commercial development that needs foundation work. You'll be working with Tony's crew. Norman nodded. What should I tell them about why I'm there? The truth, that you're learning the business from the ground up because you want to understand what it really means to build something. And if they think I'm just playing around, slumming it for a few weeks, I smiled. Then you'll have to prove them wrong, every day, for 5 years. Norman stood up, extending his hand to me. Deal. I shook his hand, feeling the calluses that would soon develop from real work. Deal. As he headed toward the door, he paused. Dad, what happens if I fail? If I can't handle the physical work, or if I don't learn fast enough? Then you fail, I said simply. But you'll fail trying to become something better than what you were. That's more than most people can say. Norman nodded and left. I watched him drive away, noting that he didn't turn toward the house he shared with Olivia. Instead, he headed toward downtown, probably to find an apartment where he could start his new life without the weight of her expectations. An hour later, my phone rang. Olivia's number. "Stephen," her voice was tight with controlled fury, "I want to talk to you." "About what?" "About the way you're destroying my marriage." I almost laughed. I didn't forge anyone's signature or lose $250,000 to a con artist. "You manipulated Norman with that DNA test. You knew it would turn him against me." I told him the truth. What he does with that information is his choice. "He's leaving me," she said, her voice cracking. 8 years of marriage, and he's throwing it all away because you've convinced him he needs to prove something. "Olivia," I said gently, "Norman isn't leaving you because of me. He's leaving you because you betrayed his trust in the most fundamental way possible." "I did everything for us," she screamed. "Everything I did was to secure our future." "Everything you did was to secure your future," I corrected. "Norman was just the vehicle you planned to use." She was quiet for a long moment, and when she spoke again, her voice was different, smaller. "What if I apologize? What if I make it right?" "Can you make it right?" I asked. "Can you give him back the trust you broke? Can you undo the lies you told and the fraud you committed?" "I can try." "Then try," I said, "but don't expect him to make it easy for you. Trust once broken is the hardest thing in the world to rebuild." After I hung up, I sat at the kitchen table for a long time, thinking about trust and truth and the price we pay for both. Margaret had broken my trust once and spent 34 years earning it back. Norman had broken my trust by being careless with the opportunities I'd given him, but he was starting the hard work of earning it back. Whether Olivia would do the same remained to be seen, but for the first time in years, I felt hopeful about the future, not because I knew how things would turn out, but because I finally believed Norman had the strength to handle whatever came next. The real test would begin tomorrow morning at 6 a.m., when my son learned what it meant to earn something he couldn't lose. 5 years and 3 months later, I stood in the same study where everything had changed, but this time the atmosphere was entirely different. Norman sat across from my desk, but he wasn't the same man who'd demanded his inheritance that day after Margaret's funeral. His hands were calloused now, his shoulders broader from physical work. There was a confidence in his posture that came from knowing he'd earned his place at this table. "The Henderson project came in under budget and ahead of schedule," he was saying, reviewing the quarterly reports with the kind of attention to detail I'd never seen from him before. "Tony says it's because we finally got a system where the office and the field crews actually communicate." I smiled at that. Tony Fernandez had been skeptical when Norman first showed up on his crew, expecting another spoiled rich kid who'd disappear after a few days of real work. Instead, Norman had spent 6 months learning to read blueprints, mix concrete, and understand the difference between theoretical knowledge and practical skill. More importantly, he'd learned to listen to men who'd been doing this work longer than he'd been alive. "What about the Riverside expansion?" I asked. "Profitable, but barely. We could increase margins by cutting labor costs, but I don't recommend it. Jim Sullivan's crew has been with us for 8 years. They know the work, they're efficient, and their loyalty is worth more than the few thousand we'd save by hiring cheaper workers." There it was, the understanding that had taken him 3 years to develop, that Crawford Industries wasn't just about profit margins and quarterly reports. It was about relationships, about responsibility, about building something that lasted. "Good analysis," I said. "What's your recommendation for next year?" Norman leaned back in his chair, the gesture so similar to something I might have done that it made my chest tight. "Controlled growth. We take on projects that challenge us but don't overextend our resources. We invest in training for our existing crews rather than hiring quantity over quality, and we maintain the profit-sharing program even if it means lower executive compensation." 5 years ago, Norman wouldn't have known we had a profit-sharing program, much less understood why it mattered. Now he was advocating for it even when it cost him personally. "Sounds like you've learned something about leadership," I observed. Norman's smile was rueful. "I learned that real leadership isn't about having authority. It's about earning the right to guide people who trust your judgment." I opened the bottom drawer of my desk and pulled out a folder I'd been saving for this moment. "These came yesterday." Norman took the papers, his eyebrows rising as he read. "Transfer documents? Effective today, you own 51% of Crawford Industries," I said. "Congratulations, son." The word son still carried weight between us, even after 5 years of working through what it meant. Norman had never tried to contact Robert Hayes's family, had never expressed interest in exploring that side of his genetics. "You raised me," he'd said once during his 2nd year of the challenge. "That makes you my father in every way that matters." Norman stared at the documents for a long time. Dad, I need to ask you something, and I need you to be honest. Always. Did you always plan to give me the company, even before I proved anything? I'd been dreading this question for months, knowing it would eventually come. No, I said honestly. When I designed the trust, I genuinely didn't know if you'd accept the challenge or if you'd succeed at it. The dissolution provision wasn't a bluff. I was prepared to end the company rather than let it be destroyed by someone who didn't understand its value. Norman nodded slowly. Good. That makes this mean something. We sat in comfortable silence, both of us understanding that this moment marked the end of one relationship and the beginning of another. For 5 years I'd been his teacher and evaluator. Now I was simply his father and business partner. There's something else, Norman said. Olivia and I finalized our divorce last week. I wasn't surprised. They'd been separated for 4 years, ever since Norman had refused to quit the challenge and Olivia had refused to accept the conditions I'd laid out for paying off her fraudulent loan. She'd eventually declared bankruptcy and moved back in with her mother, spending the last few years working as a receptionist at a dentist's office while attending community college. How do you feel about that? I asked. Relieved, Norman said honestly. I kept hoping we could rebuild something, but you can't build a foundation on lies. She never really loved me. She loved what she thought I represented. Have you heard from her lately? Norman's expression darkened slightly. She called last week when the divorce was finalized. Apparently she's engaged to her bankruptcy attorney. She wanted to congratulate me on finally getting what I always wanted. I felt a flare of anger at Olivia's pettiness, but Norman seemed unaffected. The funny thing is, he continued, she still doesn't understand what I actually wanted. It was never about the money or the company. It was about knowing I could earn something that mattered. A knock on the study door interrupted us. Come in, I called. Tony Fernandez entered, his work boots carefully wiped clean, his face split by the wide grin he'd worn ever since Norman had been promoted to project manager 3 years ago. Sorry to interrupt, Mr. Crawford, but I wanted to congratulate Norman on making it official. He crossed to Norman and shook his hand firmly. 5 years ago, I thought you were just another rich kid playing around. I was wrong. You've earned your place here. Thank you, Tony. That means more to me than you know. After Tony left, Norman turned back to me. I have a proposal. I'm listening. I want to establish the Margaret Crawford Foundation, a nonprofit that provides college scholarships for children of construction workers and tradespeople. Fund it with 5% of the company's annual profits. I felt my throat tighten at the mention of Margaret's name. She would have loved that. I know. I remember her talking about how hard it was for you to afford college when you were starting out. She always said education was the foundation of everything else you built. It was true. Margaret had worked 2 jobs to help me finish my degree, had sacrificed her own educational dreams to support mine. A foundation in her name, helping other families avoid those struggles, felt like the perfect memorial. I'll have David draw up the papers, I said. As the afternoon wore on, we discussed plans for the company's future, the foundation's structure, and Norman's vision for growth. But beneath the business conversation was something deeper, a recognition that we'd both become different people than we'd been 5 years ago. I was no longer the controlling father terrified of letting go. Norman was no longer the entitled son afraid of failing. We'd found our way to a relationship based on mutual respect rather than obligation or expectation. Dad, Norman said as we wrapped up, I want you to know something. These 5 years weren't just about proving I could run the company. They were about proving I could be the son you and Mom deserved. You were always that son, I said quietly. You just needed to discover it for yourself. As Norman left that evening, carrying his first official briefing as majority owner of Crawford Industries, I realized that Margaret would have been proud of both of us. Not because Norman had inherited the company, but because he'd inherited something more valuable, the understanding that some things in life have to be earned, not given. 2 months later, I stood in the backyard where Margaret's rose garden bloomed in full summer glory, watching Norman direct the construction of the foundation's first scholarship award ceremony. He moved among the workers with easy authority, respected but not distant, trusted because he'd proven himself worthy of trust. The boy who'd once demanded his inheritance was gone, replaced by a man who understood that the best things in life, respect, trust, love, purpose, could never be inherited at all. They could only be earned, one honest day at a time, and And as I watched him work, surrounded by people who chose to follow him because he'd shown them he deserved their loyalty, I knew that Margaret and I had finally succeeded in the most important job of our lives. We'd raised a son who understood that true wealth had nothing to do with what you owned and everything to do with what you'd earned the right to build. The company was in good hands. More importantly, Norman had finally found his way home to himself, and that was the inheritance no will could ever provide. Now I'm curious about you who listened to my story. What would you do if you were in my place? Have you ever been through something similar? Comment below, and meanwhile, I'm leaving on the final screen 2 other stories that are channel favorites, and they will definitely surprise you. Thank you for watching until here.